They won't tell you this directly, but the moment you stop chasing them is often the moment they start noticing you the most. They can already tell what you're going to say before you even say it. And for some reason, that unsettles them. Not because you're inaccurate, but because you keep landing on the truth too often. If you've ever noticed someone start to pull away the moment you started trying harder to get close, stay with this for a moment. Because what you're about to hear will completely shift how you understand that kind of connection. Before we go further, type the word mirror in the comments. Just that word. It signals that you're someone who actually wants to understand what's happening beneath the surface, and it helps this message reach the people who need it most. What most people don't realize is that this kind of dynamic isn't random. It's not bad timing. It's not you being too much, too sensitive, or not enough. There is a pattern behind it. There's a specific type of person who tends to end up in these avoidant dynamics. Not by accident, but by design of their emotional wiring. They often come across as deeply perceptive, almost like they can sense what others are feeling before anything is spoken. This is what people refer to as a super empath. And if that's you, then this isn't just someone in your life. It can feel like they're in your thoughts constantly, like they take up space in your mind even when they're not there. And the uncomfortable truth is, you might be doing the same thing to them, even if neither of you admits it. A super empath isn't just a sensitive person. Sensitivity is surface level. This is something far more developed. It's the ability to read emotional energy with extreme precision, to notice shifts in tone, silence, timing, and behavior that others completely miss. To feel when something is wrong, even when everything looks fine on the outside. That ability usually isn't random. It's often shaped early in life, in emotions where emotional unpredictability made awareness necessary. Over time, they learn that survival, safety, and connection all depend on reading people accurately. So they become highly attuned, not by choice, but by adaptation. Now, on the other side, you have the avoidant. The avoidant learned a completely different lesson early on. That closeness can lead to discomfort. That depending on people can lead to disappointment. So over time, they build distance as protection. Not because they don't feel, but because feeling too deeply without control once felt unsafe. So they become skilled at holding things in, at appearing composed even when they're not, at keeping conversations light when something much deeper is happening underneath. They learn how to stay connected just enough to not feel alone, but not close enough to feel exposed. And then the two of you meet. When a super empath and an avoidant cross paths, it doesn't feel ordinary. It feels like recognition, like something clicks that's hard to explain. The super empath looks at the avoidant and sees beyond the surface, beyond the distance, the calm expression, the self-control. They sense what's underneath it, the parts that feel hidden, guarded, maybe even tired of being alone. And they think without saying it, I understand you. I can reach you. I can make this feel safe enough for you to open up. Meanwhile, the avoidant experiences something unexpected too. Being around the super empath doesn't feel demanding at first. It feels calm, familiar in a way they can't explain. For a moment, they don't feel pressured to perform or protect themselves as much. So they allow a little more closeness than usual. And that's how it starts. At first, it feels almost perfect. The avoidant opens up in small, controlled ways. There's more laughter, more sharing, more moments that feel real. The super empath feels it too, that rare sense of being truly seen by someone who doesn't usually let people in. But then, gradually, something shifts. It starts small, slight delays in replies, a change in tone, plans that get reshuffled with explanations that don't fully land. Nothing dramatic on its own, but together it creates distance you can feel, even if you can't always prove it. And that's where the dynamic begins to reveal itself. A conversation that starts to open up in a real way, and then somehow gets steered back into something neutral again. The avoidant isn't pulling away in a dramatic or obvious way, just enough that you feel the shift. And because you're a super empath, you don't miss those shifts. You notice everything. So you respond the way super empaths usually do. You lean in. You try to understand. You get a little more present, a little more available. You put in more effort to recreate that early connection, that feeling of warmth and closeness that felt so effortless in the beginning. And the more you move toward them, the more they subtly move back. This becomes the pattern, the loop, the cycle that can repeat for months, sometimes years, sometimes an entire relationship, without ever really breaking. The super empath pursues closeness. The avoidant creates distance. The super empath notices the distance and softens, hoping it helps. The avoidant takes that as safety and edges slightly closer again. The super empath feels hope return. And then, almost inevitably, the avoidant retreats once more. But the part that most people misunderstand is this. The avoidant isn't pulling away because they don't care. They're pulling away because they do. Because when things start to feel real, vulnerability comes with it. And vulnerability for the avoidant doesn't feel like intimacy. It feels like exposure, like risk, like something they learned early on to protect themselves from. Not because they can't feel deeply, but because they've spent a lifetime learning what happens when feeling deeply leads to pain, rejection, or disappointment. So instead of moving toward that risk, they create distance. Not to punish you, not to confuse you, but to regulate what feels overwhelming inside them. And at the center of that distance is a fear they rarely confront directly. The fear of letting someone fully in and still not being enough. Or letting someone in and losing them anyway. So it feels safer not to fully open that door at all. Meanwhile, inside the super empath, something very different is happening. Your mind doesn't let go. It keeps working, replaying conversations, reanalyzing tone, timing, words, silence, trying to find meaning in small changes, trying to locate the exact moment something shifted, building interpretations, then questioning them, then rebuilding them again. Not because you're overthinking for no reason, but because your entire emotional system is designed to track connection, to read people, to understand emotional signals. And this person is sending signals that don't line up, so your mind keeps trying to solve it. So they don't just occupy your thoughts occasionally. They become a background presence, something running constantly in the mind, morning, day, and night. Even in silence, there's a part of you still trying to figure it out. And what's rarely acknowledged is that the reverse is also true, just in a quieter way. You exist in their mind too, not with the same intensity, not with the same constant emotional processing, but in the moments where things get quiet enough for their defenses to ease, in the pauses where they're not performing distance or control, in the late-night thoughts they don't fully develop into words. You come up. Not always clearly, not always comfortably, but you're there. They think about what it would be like to stay open, to not pull back, to not create space, to actually let the connection continue without interruption. And then, almost as quickly as it appears, that thought gets pushed back down again. Because the gap between what they feel and what they express is wide. Sometimes so wide, it becomes unmanageable. So instead of bridging it, they manage it through distance. And this is where the tragedy sits. Two people who are both affected by each other, both emotionally invested in their own ways, both thinking about each other far more than they admit, and yet still unable to actually meet in a stable middle ground because their emotional patterns were built in opposite directions. And for the super empath, that creates a very specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being right next to someone and still not being able to reach them fully. Of sensing someone so clearly, so deeply, and still feeling like there's an invisible barrier between you that effort alone cannot dissolve. And because super empaths are natural fixers, natural nurturers, people who instinctively move toward emotional discomfort instead of away from it, they don't stop trying. They adjust. They experiment. They analyze the dynamic from every possible angle. They pull back because they've read that space helps avoidance feel safer. Then they lean in again because distance feels like loss. They try being softer, then clearer, then more direct, then more detached. They journal about it. They talk it through with friends. They watch videos. They search for patterns, frameworks, explanations, anything that might finally make it click. All of it is driven by a quiet but powerful belief. If they can just understand this correctly, if they can just find the right approach, the right timing, the right emotional key, then the connection they felt in the beginning will come back and finally stabilize into something real, because those early moments felt undeniable. The openness, the ease, the sense that something rare was forming, the way the avoidant seemed to lean in before everything started shifting. That version of the connection doesn't feel imagined. It feels like proof that it could work. But there's a truth here that's hard to sit with, and it needs to be said plainly. A super empath cannot fix an avoidant. They cannot heal them. They cannot love them into emotional safety. Not because the love is lacking, not because the intention is wrong, but because the origin of avoidant patterns predates the relationship entirely. It was formed long before you entered the picture, and it is maintained by internal protective mechanisms that no external person can override through consistency, patience, or emotional depth. The only person who can change that system is the avoidant themselves. And only if they reach a point where they are willing to look at what they've spent years avoiding, understand where it came from, and actively do the work of changing it. That process cannot be outsourced. It cannot be accelerated by being loved harder. It cannot be stabilized by someone else holding the emotional weight of it. For a super empath, this realization often lands like a fracture, because so much of their identity, often without them even realizing it, is built on the idea that their emotional presence can create change in people. And in many situations, it does. Their empathy, their attunement, their ability to hold space, these things genuinely help people open up and heal. But avoidant dynamics don't respond to intensity of care in the same way. In fact, the more meaningful the connection feels, the more the avoidant system tends to activate. Because closeness doesn't register as safety to them, it registers as risk. So the cycle continues. The more the super empath leans into connection, the more the avoidant feels pressure they can't regulate. And the more the avoidant pulls away, the more the super empath tries to understand and repair what suddenly feels unstable. So where does that leave you, if you recognize yourself in this? It starts with this: nothing about your capacity to feel is wrong. Your depth, your sensitivity, your ability to read emotional nuance, these are not flaws, they are strengths. But in this dynamic, they are being directed towards someone who cannot consistently receive what you're offering. Not because they don't value it at moments, but because it activates something inside them they haven't resolved. Second, the connection you felt wasn't imagined. Those early moments of closeness, that sense of being seen and chosen and emotionally met, they were real experiences. The avoidant wasn't pretending in those moments. The openness was genuine. But consistency is a different capacity than feeling. And what you were witnessing was someone who can access connection but cannot yet sustain it without retreating. That distinction matters because it prevents you from rewriting the past as illusion. It wasn't an illusion. It just wasn't stable. Third, the mental spiral, the replaying, the decoding, the constant searching for meaning in every shift and silence, is not obsession in the simple sense. It is an intelligent system trying to resolve inconsistency. Your mind is built to read people, predict patterns, and create emotional coherence. But inconsistency breaks that system. So it keeps running, trying to solve something that isn't behaving like a solvable equation. And the only real exit from that loop is not more analysis of them. It's a return to you. To what you feel when you're not trying to interpret someone else's behavior. To what you need in a relationship that feels steady, reciprocal, and emotionally available. To whether you are actually receiving that, or slowly adapting yourself to less and less of it, in the hope that it will eventually turn into more. Because what often happens with super empaths is not that they ignore their needs. It's that they postpone them indefinitely in favor of understanding someone else's. And that delay eventually turns into exhaustion, then confusion, then a quieter emotional weight that shows up as frustration, sadness, or even resentment. Not because you didn't care enough, but because you cared without equal return. And underneath that is grief. Grief for what the connection almost became. Grief for the version of the person that appeared in the beginning. Grief for the effort that felt meaningful, but never fully landed. None of that is a sign you were wrong to care. It's a sign you're reaching the point where the imbalance is no longer something you can ignore. And when you look at the avoidant's inner world more clearly, the dynamic makes even more sense and becomes less personal. When you offer closeness, attention, emotional depth, and real presence, it doesn't register as simple comfort for them. It registers as both invitation and threat at the same time. Part of them wants it, part of them is drawn to it, and another part immediately activates protection. Because closeness, in their internal system, quickly translates into dependence. And dependence translates into vulnerability. And vulnerability, in their history, has not felt safe to stay in for long. So the pullback isn't a rejection of you as a person. It's a reflexive step away from what emotional closeness starts to activate inside them. And if I lose myself, I lose the one thing that has always been mine, my own emotional autonomy, my own internal safety, the version of me that exists on my own terms, untouched by the unpredictability of someone else's choices. That belief sits right at the core of avoidant behavior. Not as something they consciously decided, not as a strategy they sat down and built, but as something shaped through earlier experiences where closeness didn't feel safe, where depending on others led to disappointment, or where emotional needs were met inconsistently enough to teach a simple internal rule. Don't rely too deeply on anyone. So, over time, they build a self that can stand alone, a version of them that is self-contained, self-sufficient, capable, functional, often even impressive from the outside. They can manage life well. They can perform, achieve, stay composed. People often describe them as having things together, as being strong, independent, grounded. But what isn't visible is the internal structure behind that strength. There is usually a younger emotional layer underneath all of it, a part of them that learned early on that closeness carries risk, that needing someone too much can lead to loss, that safety sometimes requires distance. And those lessons don't disappear just because the adult version of them is more capable now. So when real emotional closeness starts to form, something inside them reacts. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because closeness activates an old protective system. And that system interprets emotional depth as potential loss of control, loss of safety, loss of self. And in response, it pulls away from exactly what it also wants. That's the painful contradiction at the center of it. And it is not only unfair to the super empath, it is also deeply conflicted inside the avoidant themselves. Because they are not acting from clarity. They are acting from a divided internal state. One part wanting connection, another part treating connection as danger. So when the super empath sees that underlying vulnerability and reaches toward it with care, patience, and emotional understanding, what gets activated is not simple comfort for the avoidant. It is alarm. Not alarm about you, but alarm about what it feels like to be seen that closely. Because being seen that deeply can feel like being exposed. And exposure, in their internal world, has historically not been safe to sit in for long. So the very thing the avoidant longs for, real closeness, is also the thing their system is trained to retreat from when it arrives. This is where the dynamic becomes so emotionally complicated. Because the super empath is not wrong in what they sense. The connection is real. The moments of openness are real. The feeling of something meaningful forming is real. But the avoidant's capacity to sustain that state without retreating is limited until they do their own internal work. And no amount of understanding from the outside can replace that process. And that's where a difficult truth becomes unavoidable. Understanding this pattern does not mean you have to remain inside it. It does not mean you keep adjusting yourself to fit into a cycle that repeatedly destabilizes you. It does not mean you continue offering depth in a place where depth is intermittently received and intermittently rejected. Understanding it simply gives you clarity. And with clarity comes choice. You can stay, but only if you are honest about what the dynamic actually is, and only if your needs are not being quietly erased in the process. Or you can recognize that the kind of love you are capable of giving needs consistency in order to thrive, not occasional access followed by withdrawal. Neither path is easy, but only one of them stops you from betraying yourself. Because what often gets lost in this dynamic is not just emotional energy, it is self-abandonment disguised as patience, waiting disguised as hope, over-giving disguised as love. And super empaths rarely notice the shift until they are already exhausted. Because their attention is so focused outward on understanding, interpreting, repairing, anticipating, that their own emotional needs become secondary. Sometimes so secondary that they only become visible once depletion sets in. And when that depletion finally surfaces, it carries everything at once. Grief for what almost worked, frustration for what keeps repeating, sadness for what keeps disappearing, and sometimes a quiet anger at how much of themselves they have poured into something that never fully held them back. None of that means you are wrong to love. It means you are human in a situation that continuously asked you to stretch beyond what is sustainable. And when you look at the avoidant's internal experience more clearly, it becomes less about blame and more about structure. Because when you move toward them with warmth, consistency, emotional depth, and genuine presence, it doesn't land as simple safety in their nervous system. It lands as something dual. Part of them experiences it as connection, something grounding, even comforting, and another part experiences it as pressure, because closeness begins to carry implications, expectation, dependence, emotional responsibility, and the fear of not being able to maintain it without eventually losing themselves in the process. So the withdrawal is not a rejection of your value. It is a reflexive attempt to manage internal tension they haven't fully learned how to hold yet. And that's where the cycle continues. Closeness, activation, withdrawal, confusion, return, and repetition. A loop where both people are real, both people are affected, and neither person is able to fully stabilize the connection on their own. And that is exactly why the only way out of it is not more effort, not more analysis, not more adaptation, but clearer awareness of what is actually happening and what it is costing you to remain inside it. And maybe the clearest ending to all of this is simply knowing that love that repeatedly asks you to lose yourself in order to keep it is not the kind of love that is meant to be your home.